The crowd gathered under gaslit ceilings as the mummy's glass case was unveiled, but no one expected what followed. Within days, strange illnesses, sudden accidents, and whispered deaths began circling the museum. Some called it coincidence. Others called it a curse. And once the stories began, London could not look away. The winter fog hung thick over London, turning the streets into pale rivers of shadow and light. Inside one of the city's most celebrated Victorian museums, excitement pulsed through the halls as visitors pressed closer to see the latest marvel brought from the sands of Egypt. The mummy lay perfectly still behind glass, its linen wrappings browned by centuries, its face frozen in a silent expression that felt almost watchful. Curators spoke proudly of history preserved, of science conquering time. Yet from the very first night something felt wrong. A guard named Thomas Wilkes swore the temperature dropped suddenly when he passed the case. "It's like the air itself goes quiet," he muttered, pulling his coat tighter. By morning, he was found collapsed at his post, feverish and trembling, unable to explain what he had seen in the dark. Rumors spread quickly through the museum staff. A young assistant fell ill after cataloguing the artifacts. A senior curator slipped on the grand staircase, breaking his leg in a fall witnesses insisted made no sense. Newspapers seized the whispers, dressing them in dramatic language, hinting at an ancient curse awakened by human arrogance. Visitors arrived not just to learn, but to feel the thrill of fear. Mothers clutched their children's hands. Gentlemen scoffed loudly, yet lingered longer than planned. The mummy became less an artifact and more a presence, as if it were silently measuring everyone who stared too long. Late one evening, a heated argument broke out between Dr. Edward Mallory, a rational man of science, and Margaret Hale, a historian deeply familiar with Egyptian burial rites. "You cannot dismiss belief so easily," she warned. To the ancients, disturbing the dead was a violation with consequences. Mallory shook his head. "Belief does not break bones or cause fevers," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Outside, the bells of London rang, echoing through the fog like a warning no one could quite interpret. As weeks passed, the stories grew darker. A journalist named Samuel Crowe began investigating the incidents, convinced there was more than superstition at work. He interviewed guards, cleaners, scholars, anyone who had spent time near the mummy. One cleaner whispered that she heard faint scratching from inside the case. Another claimed the mummy's shadow looked different every night. Samuel, a skeptic by nature, felt unease settle in his chest despite himself. "People want a monster," he told his editor, "but fear can make liars of us all." Still, he couldn't ignore the pattern forming before him. Meanwhile, Margaret Hale pored over ancient texts late into the night. She discovered inscriptions warning that the dead must remain undisturbed, or their unrest would spill into the world of the living. When she shared her findings, the museum board dismissed them as myth. Attendance had tripled. Closing the exhibit was unthinkable. Yet the city outside seemed to mirror the tension inside the museum. Horses bolted without cause. Fires broke out in narrow alleys. Londoners spoke of a heaviness in the air, a sense that something old and angry had been awakened. One evening, Samuel stayed after hours, hiding among the columns as the lights dimmed. The museum fell silent, broken only by the soft tick of cooling metal. He stood before the mummy's case, notebook trembling in his hands. For a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he saw the linen shift, just slightly. His heart raced, his rational mind screaming for explanation. When nothing else happened, he fled into the night, shaken by the realization that doubt no longer protected him. By morning, news broke that a respected archaeologist connected to the exhibit had died suddenly in his sleep. London erupted. Some demanded answers. Others demanded the mummy be removed. And beneath it all, the question grew louder. How many tragedies could be coincidence before belief became truth? Authorities finally intervened, launching an official inquiry. Scientists tested air quality, checked for toxins, examined every inch of the case. Their findings were ordinary. their conclusions unsatisfying. Yet the deaths continued. Margaret confronted Dr. Mallory again, her eyes filled with urgency. "If we are wrong," she said quietly, "then we lose nothing by respecting the dead. But if we are right—" She didn't finish the sentence. The museum agreed to close the exhibit temporarily. On the final day, crowds gathered in uneasy silence. Some prayed. As the mummy was prepared for removal, a sudden crash echoed through the hall when a support beam gave way without warning. No one was hurt, but the message felt clear to those watching. This was not over. That night, Samuel wrote the article of his life, not declaring a curse, but admitting uncertainty. "Perhaps," he wrote, "the true danger lies not in ancient wrath, but in our refusal to accept what we cannot fully explain." His words struck a nerve, capturing the city's conflicted heart. When the mummy was finally sealed away, the accidents stopped. The illnesses faded. London slowly returned to itself, though the memory lingered like a scar. People argued for years about what really happened, science battling belief in endless debate. And somewhere in the museum's quiet archives, beneath layers of dust and locked doors, the mummy rested once more, silent, unmoving, and inscrutable. Whether it had ever been cursed no one could prove. But those who lived through the spectacle never forgot the feeling that history, when disturbed, sometimes watches back. Final part. The final chapter of the story did not arrive with a scream or a spectacle. It came quietly, the way truth often does, slipping in when no one is looking for it. Months after the mummy had been sealed away from public view, London tried to forget. The newspapers moved on. The crowds thinned. The museum returned to its usual rhythm of hushed footsteps and polite curiosity. Yet for those who had stood too close to the glass, who had felt that strange weight in the air, forgetting was never truly possible. Margaret Hale resigned from the museum shortly after the exhibit closed. On her last day, she stood alone in the archive room, staring at the crate that held the mummy, now wrapped in layers of warning labels and official seals. "You deserved peace," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to the dead or to herself. As she turned away, she felt something lift from her chest, a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying. For the first time in months, she slept without dreams. Dr. Edward Mallory, however, was not granted such relief. His reputation survived the controversy, but his certainty did not. He continued lecturing about rational explanations, about mass hysteria and coincidence, yet his voice sometimes faltered when students asked about the mummy. Late at night, alone in his study, he replayed moments he could not explain: the sudden cold, the timing of the accidents, the look on Thomas Wilkes' face when he spoke of silence. Mallory never admitted belief, but doubt followed him like a shadow he could not outrun. Samuel Crow's article became legendary. Readers wrote letters from across the country, sharing their own experiences with the unexplained. "Thank you for not laughing at us," one letter read. Another simply said, "Some things are older than reason." Samuel kept those letters in a drawer, returning to them whenever he questioned his own memory of that night in the museum. He never claimed to have seen the mummy move. But he also never said it hadn't. Years passed. Gas lamps gave way to electric light. London modernized, rebuilt, and redefined itself. The story of the mummy faded into folklore, retold in pubs and whispered during late-night walks along the Thames. Most listeners smiled politely, dismissing it as a Victorian ghost tale. Yet every version shared the same ending. Once the dead were left alone, the darkness lifted. Then, decades later, a young archivist stumbled upon the old records. Illness reports, accident logs, handwritten notes from curators who no longer lived. The pattern was undeniable. She brought the findings to her superiors, suggesting renewed study, perhaps even a new exhibit framed as history rather than spectacle. The proposal was quietly declined. Some doors, the museum had learned, were better left closed. On a fog-heavy evening not unlike the first, a night guard paused outside the archive room. He felt it, The same sudden stillness Thomas Wilkes had described so long ago. The guard hesitated, heart pounding, then shook his head and walked on. By morning the feeling was gone. No illness followed. No accident occurred. Respect, it seemed, made all the difference. And so the story ends where it began, with a choice. To stare at the past as entertainment, or to approach it with humility. Whether the mummy was truly cursed no one can say for certain. But London learned something deeper than fear. It learned that belief has power, that history is not inert, and that some mysteries endure not because they defy explanation, but because they remind us of our limits. Even now, if you stand in the quiet halls of that old museum after closing time, you might feel it too. Not terror, not dread, just a presence. A reminder that the line between the known and the unknowable is thinner than we like to believe. And perhaps that is the most unbelievable truth of all. As the lights dim on this chapter of history, one question still lingers in the shadows. Was London's mummy nothing more than a coincidence wrapped in fear, or a warning carried across centuries? Stories like this survive not because they are proven, but because they make us pause, doubt, and wonder. If you enjoyed exploring this unbelievable mystery, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, sometimes the past is silent for a reason. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and keep watching the unbelievable.